Hey everyone, David Chen here from Decoding TV. There's a new show on Apple TV Plus right now called The Studio. It's very funny. So I chatted with my regular co-host Patrick Klepek about The Studio. We reviewed the show and talked about how we thought it served as a satire of the current state of Hollywood. The Studio shares a lot in common with Robert Altman's 1992 film The Player. Both The Studio and The Player are about what it's like to make movies in Hollywood, and they also have a character with the same name, Griffin Mill. So I wanted to check out the player, watch the player, and talk about how it related to the studio and to the current state of Hollywood. So I was really pleased to be able to chat with film critic Matt Goldberg from the newsletter Commentary Track about the player. We talked about that movie, just overall thoughts, as well as how it relates with the studio and whether it's still relevant today. So you're about to hear my chat with Patrick Klepek about the studio, followed by my conversation with Matt Goldberg about the player. Enjoy the episode.
Are you explaining supporting women to me?
I know.
Support me from anywhere on earth other than here.
Okay.
Welcome to Decoding TV's coverage of The Studio. In The Studio, Seth Rogen stars as Matt Remick, the newly appointed head of the fictional Continental Studios. Desperate for celebrity approval, he and his executive team must juggle corporate demands with creative ambitions as they try to keep movies alive and relevant. I'm reading here from the plot summary on Apple TV Plus. The first few episodes of The Studio are out. Patrick Klepek has seen 2 episodes. I've seen 4. And you should assume there will be spoilers for the first 2 episodes in this conversation, at least. All that being said, Patrick Klepek, overall thoughts on The Studio?
I don't know who this show is for, but it's for me, and I'm having a really good time with it. It's a brilliant satire that is also just extremely funny, insightful, and frankly, kind of heartwarming about how difficult it is to make commercial art. I'm having a blast with the first 2 episodes. I'm anxious to watch more, and I hope the rest is as good as what's here. And I'm not really sure where the show is going, but I'm having a really fun time with the ride so far. It is clearly a show written by people who have gone through the Hollywood meat grinder. And if you are listening to this podcast, watching us on YouTube, my guess is you're also paying attention to the trades and like the meat grinder itself. And if you have any interest in that, this feels like both a satire, but also like deeply realistic about the competing forces at play when it comes to making films. It has probably been true to some degree forever, but is very about our modern age and what it is like to make films right now. It feels like it goes very hand in hand with, I'm forgetting the name of the other show.
Franchise.
I know you watched it, the franchise. These shows feel complementary to one another, speaking to different parts of modern filmmaking and how do you be an artist in an age of IP?
I have a couple thoughts on The Studio. First of all, I want to say, in general, I love the show. It's hugely enjoyable. I'd recommend it to basically anyone. Like, it's super fun. And what's great about the show is every episode feels very different. Like they're exploring a different element of what it means to be a head of a studio and the things that you need to be, the undignified things you need to subject yourself to as head of a studio, but also, the challenges and how it's difficult to navigate all the people that want something from you. And that's one of the main themes that emerges from, I've seen the first 4 episodes, right? Is that like, we've talked about this in the past. Somebody posted on Twitter. I don't remember exactly what the post was. I'm sorry if I don't get it exactly right. But it's about what it's like to be a billionaire and how, like, if you're a billionaire, like, your life is just a set of a never-ending set of your own preferences. Like, literally, whatever you want, you can have. And if you want, hey, I want a 5,000-pound chair to sit in, like you can have it. And cognitively, it must be like being kicked in the head by a horse. Basically, it's like because you can have anything you want, like your whole life view is distorted. And that's definitely something you get when you're watching the first few episodes of The Studio. Is like, once this guy becomes studio head, everyone wants something from him, so they all kind of like are nice to him and they butter him up and they flatter him. But you can never know if the reason they're doing that is because they want something from you or they genuinely like you. And I think over time that probably takes some kind of mental toll. So I think that's kind of interesting. Stylistically, the show is also quite interesting. It uses the same, for lack of a better descriptor, it uses the same style as Iñárritu's Birdman. The episodes are done in long, continuous shots. So, like, a single episode might have like 8 shots in it or something. Like, I'm exaggerating, but like very few shots. The camera kind of follows along with these people as they're traveling from room to room. And there's this kind of jazzy drum score that undergirds the whole thing. And so Birdman, which by the way was a movie about how critics are terrible and the people who make art, are actually like the brave ones. So I think it does kind of fit in with the tone there. But I really appreciated the style because we just finished talking about adolescence here on Decoding TV, and we talked about how like there's blood in the work, like there's risk to them trying to do the show in long continuous shots. But it makes it feel more like theater. It makes it feel more like these people are like interacting with each other and improvising in ways that are unpredictable, and like you don't know what's going to happen next. And that does a lot to drive my interest in the show personally. So really loving the style. Patrick Klepek, what did you think of the style of the studio?
Yeah, I haven't picked up on it as much as you. I think because I'm just so taken by and this is like wrapped up in sort of the style of the show, but just like like every time like the camera pans over, it's like some other person that I've seen that has like incredible comedic chops, and like just watching all these people bounce off one, like the energy in like every scene is just like off the charts in a way that is just really surprising and fun. And I think by having these long takes, it only, we, in terms of adolescence, we talked about like, well, over the course of like an hour of like one single take in a show that is very dour and serious and often upsetting, there must be some improvisation happening there that we're not as aware of. In comedy, like you feel like you can pick up on that a little bit more. Like it's very obvious, like, oh, I imagine like this hallway scene went a couple of different ways, but around the same subject matter. And like, this is the one we kind of end up with in the show. And just like watching all these people work, like for the lack of a better term, like while shot, like comedy is not usually shot as beautifully as this. And like, that's part of, I think, what makes the studio really interesting is that there's a real mashup of a lot of like real traditional comedic setups and payoffs and exaggerated characters, but also like really stunning camera angles that I'm just not usually used to seeing lined up with the same stuff. And it makes for a really interesting show, like just all around.
I mean, yeah, every episode looks like it costs $30 million. Like the show looks incredible. Like, and later on, you start seeing more of fake movies that they're making at this Continental Studios, and it's like, wow, they like it
really
does not
went
look
for
like
it.
a shot on the volume. It looks like they actually like built sets or went on location to like make these like quote unquote fake movies, and it's just when you got that Apple TV Plus money, you might as well spend it. So like I think
Absolutely.
the show looks incredible. I do want to just compare it briefly with the franchise. I think that like, in my opinion, the franchise, which is streaming right now on Max, is a better show. I have to say, I think it's a better show because it is better written. Like the writing is so sharp, the archetypes are so like cutting in that show.
It's more cynical, wouldn't you say? I think the studio is it's ultimately an optimistic show,
right?
At least
right,
in the
right.
episodes I've seen. Like it gives the benefit of the doubt to many of the players involved. Like these are people like who want to make good art, and here's the meat grinder in front of them in order to do it. You've seen more than I, but I do think they're tackling a similar problem of filmmaking in Hollywood writ large. But one is like, look, there are people out there just want to make good stuff. And then I think the franchise is like much more pessimistic about what it means to do stuff in that system. And that permeates the whole work.
I think that's a great point, Patrick. And, but the franchise has a bunch of stuff that the studio has a bunch of stuff the franchise doesn't have, which is massive stars. Like I love all the actors in the franchise, like Hamish Patel and Richard E. Grant and so on. but this movie has this show, the studio has like all these people like guest star cameos like every episode, and of course Seth Rogen himself is like a pretty major star in the United States. He can theoretically get butts and seats on his own, and so I do wonder if this show, the studio, actually has a chance of being a quote unquote success in a way that the franchise did not, which the franchise got canceled after one season. But I think
also the studio seems more in line with like Hollywood loves to flatter itself. And I don't know that the franchise is out to like, well, like you're all trying real hard to do the good stuff, but it's just hard. And you know what I mean? Like Hollywood loves a story about Hollywood, but I don't know that the franchise is out there. There's like a feel good story about what it means to like do the work. And I sort of expect the studio's arc to be like more about that. Like I don't expect the end of this show to be like, actually, like what you shouldn't do is like, well, I don't know. I guess does the franchise end with like a sense of like what is the point? Like, what do you feel like the franchise is? We don't know what the studio is saying, right? Like, we'll probably wrap back around to that. I intend to keep watching the show. I expect you intend to keep watching the show. We can see sort of what the message is. But what do you think the message is of the franchise by the end?
I honestly think the messages are not too different, Patrick Klepek. I agree with you that the franchise is much more cynical, and both shows are about like creating art in the present studio system. The main character of the franchise is still somebody who wants to make brilliant art, like who wants to make great art, and it's just like how difficult it is to do that. And same with the character in the studio. I think, but the thing is, the main character of the franchise is I think first or second AD. I don't remember. I think he's a first AD. So it's like very low in terms of the seniority, whereas like the main character in the franchise is head of the studio. And so like they have different challenges and deal with different groups of people. But I do agree with you that the studio is like a love letter to old Hollywood, and the franchise is definitely not a love letter. It is a lot of things, but it is not a love letter. And so I definitely agree with you there. So I am having a great time with the studio. Like I said, I would literally recommend anyone watch the show. It's a blast. However, I can't help but consider, because I'm David Chen and also hosting Decoding TV with you, how some of the shortcomings of the studio. And in particular, most of the reviews of the studio have been very rapturous online, but there is one review by Nina Metz over at Chicago Tribune that I thought was really interesting. That gets at some of the issues around what the studio is trying to do. 2 and 3 decades ago, Hollywood's satire still had some teeth, whether skewering the film business, like with The Player, Swimming with Sharks, or Bowfinger, or the TV business, like with Beggars and Choosers, The TV Set, and The Comeback. These days, there's a reluctance to go for the jugular, even affectionately, despite the twin existential crises of streaming and artificial intelligence. No one in the studio is especially preoccupied with the troubling shifts brought on by either, and it's not just a missed opportunity, it's conspicuously weird. Back in the real world, people who work in the industry are in a fight for the survival of Hollywood and culture as we know it, according to entertainment columnist Richard Rusfield. But no one here is acting like we're even in this fight, let alone even trying to win it. It's as if the studio were manifested just to prove this point. If it weren't for the presence of cell phones, the show could be set in 1994, but instead of swimming with sharks, it would be swimming with guppies, end quote. So I think what Nina is saying here is that the studio feels like it came out of a different era of Hollywood where the biggest issues were like, you need to make more sequels and IP-based stuff, which definitely still is a problem today. But there are other bigger cultural, financial, capitalistic forces acting on the studio system right now that the studio doesn't even touch upon or seem concerned by. And I'm a little bit sympathetic. That, again, doesn't mean it's not a super enjoyable show. Like, episode 3 of the show is like a riff on Chinatown. It's like it's not trying to say anything grandiose necessarily, but it can just be like a fun show. It doesn't need to be like have something super insightful to say about Hollywood. Anyway, I'm curious, Patrick Klepek, like what you think about what this show is trying to say. Like it's not addressing AI. It's not really even addressing streaming to a large degree so far. Any thoughts on that?
I agree that it feels like the aesthetics dropped out of a different era, and then the verbiage has been changed around to feel modern. And I think that's because it is more comedy than satire. I think there are satirical elements to the studio, but ultimately it is a kind of like workplace comedy sort of thing, and that there's satire along the way that's like very like relate. I think you can watch The Studio and have a lot of fun if you are not really aware. Like it throws a lot of inside language, like what's variety, like what's like. There's a lot of terms you might not be familiar with that can all just wash over you. And I think you can still have a really good time when like Bryan Cranston turns around and like has like one of the most over the top performances that I was delighting in and screaming for green juice.
Where the fuck's my green juice? You want a green juice?
Yeah, I'd love one.
2 green juices.
The franchise, I think I said this when we talked, it was like, that is like as inside baseball as it gets. Like you have to be pretty seeped in like the structure of Hollywood filmmaking, I think, to really appreciate everything that it's trying to say. And I think that's to its benefit. It knows its perspective. It's sitting in that. It's working through that. I think The Studio is just more of a screwball comedy that has satirical elements. And so I think people throw around the term satire pretty liberally, when it's more probably true that The Studio has satirical elements, but that it's not primarily concerned with having a message about the problems of filmmaking in Hollywood. Because I mean, the second episode in particular, which is, the premise is like, Matt coming in, Seth Rogen's character coming in and like essentially ruining like a one shot. Like there's nothing to be like, it's not saying anything about modern film. Like if anything, like that show sort of betrays a guy that probably would know a little bit better about like how they should act on set, but it leans into the comedy because it is just funny and like super tense and upsetting to watch him like constantly mess up this shot. But I don't come out of that episode being like, well, that told me something about what it's like to make a movie these days. Like, no, like they had a fun premise and they leaned into that and it made for a really good episode of television. And I think a little bit of what that review gets at is almost like a response to The Studio, which is like, oh, I think people are going to look at this and be like, this is a biting satire of Hollywood. It's like, if it was a biting satire, Hollywood wouldn't be celebrating it. They would be upset about it, because like a true satire, a true criticism of the modern ills of working on films is like way more upsetting and frustrating and without solutions, or like easy solutions. And this show is just, at least so far, does not seem like we're going to, or if it did like touch on AI, like I think I don't know that you'll come out of it like feeling as though like, well, that's a really biting critique of like how that's, you know what I mean? I just feel like they'll lean into whatever's the funniest bit, and that'll be where the studio lands.
I do think that the way you described how a satire might work is what the franchise mostly was on Max, right? Like every episode was like, oh, hey, the producer of this MCU franchise says this group of characters in your movie already died in the last movie, and so now you need to get rid of them. How do you deal with that? Like that is actually stuff that modern filmmakers have dealt with, and I think that the stuff that happens in the studio is a little bit more fantastical and far-fetched based on what I've seen so far. I do want to say, though, one of the things that the studio, I should say, has going for it that the franchise doesn't is, with the studio, what you get to do is you get to hang with Seth Rogen and Ike Barinholtz. That's kind of what a lot of the show is. Yeah. You're hanging with these guys. And there are a lot of people out there who want to hang with these guys. Like, you remember the movie This Is the End? That movie is basically you're just hanging with those dudes. And I really enjoyed that movie, and it made $150 million worldwide. Because like, there's people out there who are like, hey, I want to hang with these dudes. I like their vibe. The franchise was not a hang show. Like the studio is a show where you're hanging with these guys. You're like, I'm along for the ride. I feel like I'm inside the club. It's super fun. So they're just very different shows in tone and what they're trying to do in many ways.
Well, they want you to imagine yourself in their shoes, right? Like, how can you not look at these two buffoons and be like, I love movies. How hard could it be? Like, I have good taste. Like the way that the second episode, or the first episode ends when like they blow up, Martin Scorsese's like film. There's the whole thing with the Kool-Aid, yada yada, and they get kicked out of Charlize Theron's party, and they end up back at Seth Rogen's place, and they make a cocktail, and they sit on this like nice looking couch outside next to a pool, and they put on one of Scorsese's films, and like they celebrate cinema, and they're like, I think that is like the hang part of it, but also the aspirational part of it is like, if you love cinema, like, don't you think you could do this job? And there's a little bit of a fantasy element, I think, that plays into the studio.
Well, what I really like about it is you find out relatively quickly that it's hard, and B, you would do a bad job of it. I think the fantasy that the studio offers is, what if someone from film Twitter became head of a film studio? And the answer is multiple catastrophes would follow. And that's basically what we end up seeing throughout the course of the show. I really appreciate the film nerd aspect of the show. Like Seth Rogen, when he's referencing other movies, those are the movies I would reference. In episode 2, he's talking about one shots. He's like, movies like Goodfellas, Children of Men. Like he's saying all the movies that I would say.
There's a little bit of like, I don't know. Seth Rogen's pretty online, and it would not shock me if by the end of the studio, maybe it's not the main point, but like a running theme is like, shut the fuck up. You don't know how hard it is to do this stuff.
Yeah. I do think that's part of it, is like, it's actually a lot harder and more complicated than you think it is. And I really appreciate that that's part of the message. I mean, I do. The other thing that kind of like, if I'm to find fault with the studio, the other thing that like kind of rubs me the wrong way is Seth Rogen's character is kind of made out to be the victim. And I think that when he's talked about making the show, that's how he's conceptualized it. He said, he was talking about The Office and how like, how can somebody rise to that part of the power structure in The Office, the show, and still like lead such a miserable life. He kind of wanted to like bring that concept out of, how can you be head of the studio but like still you're miserable to some degree. That is what the show is trying to do, is illustrate that. Now, the reason that may rub me and some other people the wrong way is like, I don't think movie studio heads are the people that have it the worst in Hollywood right now. You know what I'm saying? Like the show's like, the job is so hard. It's a meat grinder. You're needing to make these impossible decisions all the time. It's like, I guess that's probably the more cinematically interesting hard job to have. But
also Seth Rogen I'm sure he's worked really hard, but like very successful, seems to make all sorts of indulgent like projects with his friends. Like, so even like Seth Rogen himself is not the most sympathetic like actor to look. It's like, I feel like a lot of the movies I watch is like, I know it's more than just like you hanging out with your friends on set and riffing, but like there's an element of like, in the same way that Adam Sandler gets together with his friends to like make a movie with his buddies, like there's a little bit of that, but a little more high-minded in Rogen's work. So I can see that angle too.
Right. It's just like, when I look at Hollywood right now, like the person who I'm most sympathetic to is not the head of the studio. You know what I'm saying? Like the people who I'm most sympathetic to are not studio heads. And I do think the show has some self-awareness about that. It's not like completely oblivious to that idea, but just another thing about the show that's worth contemplating.
Well, I could to your point just really quickly, because I think the way it tries to early on is the dichotomy between personalities between Bryan Cranston, like the owner of the studio, and then Seth Rogen as the studio head. And I think the show's, it may not position, but like sort of what it's setting up is like, you have the well-meaning like film Twitter guy who like just wants to make good art, and then like the maniacal, mega millionaire that runs the studio. And like the reality is like studio heads are not like, are normal people, like more normal people making like calculated decisions that are impacting people. And they're not all like mustache twirling, like evil people. Like the caricature betrays the reality of like the kinds of people who are making decisions that are affecting a lot of the below the line people and their ability to do the work. And if they're all illustrated as cartoonish characters, it paints it misconstrues the picture of the kinds of people who are actually making these decisions.
Yeah. And on that note, I mean, I think that like one of the things that's that I think the show doesn't do a good job of is like being a studio head these days is actually like not a very good job. And what I mean by that is in the olden days, you would be creating art, you'd be like greenlighting movies and making movies and like actively shaping the culture. And these days, being a studio head is less like that, and it's much more managing IP. It's much more like here is the list of stuff we have. Like if you're the head of Paramount, it's like we got Paw Patrol, we got Mission Impossible, we got we got Transformers, and like how are we going to bring those to life? Let's have the Mission Impossible ride at Disney World. We'll have the Blu-ray, we'll have the blah blah. We're gonna have a Transformers spinoff. We're gonna have like that's what most of their job is right now.
Mhm.
And I do think, with the first episode in the Kool-Aid movie, it like gets at that. But and it gets at how hard it is to like create art in light of these circumstances. But like I actually think honestly, it's making the job of a studio head seem more glamorous than it is in real life. And it doesn't make it seem like it's, I think it thinks it's making it seem very unglamorous, but I think it's actually like more glamorous in the show than it is in real life because like it's being a studio head is like investor calls and like, here's how we're making sure our P&L statement is good, and here's how we're amortizing our loss of the, it's like none of that is in the show because it's boring and it's not funny, but it's like, I do think it has this very like, despite Kool-Aid movie and other things that happen in the show, it has this very like Hollywood golden era view of what it's like to make movies, for good or ill. So anyway, I think you said it right, Patrick Klepek, which is this is a show that's made for us. It's making the same pop culture references that we would make.
You don't put a Puck podcast in there without like knowing you're talking to a very specific audience.
Right. It knows who its audience is. The audience is us. Like we're having a blast with it. I'm probably going to watch the whole thing. Every episode has like a really interesting hook. And so it's just wildly entertaining show that I think like is very enjoyable. I just wouldn't look for anything that much deeper than that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like
I agree.
And I think that's something that like, as you said, there's a lot of praise for the studio going on right now, and I think a lot of it is deserved. But like, does it really show you what the ills of Hollywood are today? I don't think so. Like, I don't think it's the most insightful look at what Hollywood is doing today. So, anyway, those are some thoughts on the studio. Any other thoughts, Patrick Klepek, before we wrap up today?
No, but I can't wait to watch the rest. Like it's a very, again, whether it's insightful or biting, I don't know, and maybe I don't care, because it's that entertaining. And I think it's an easy recommend. And this is, something that I always enjoy. It's like it plays with time formats in terms of like length of episode, right? Like it is not committed to like, we've got to be an hour and like the first episode is 44 minutes. The second episode is 25-ish minutes. And so it kind of tells the story it wants to tell. And I always appreciate a show that leans into that.
You have a year and a half on your contract, and I will sue you for breach if you don't show up in the office every day. With a smile.
All right, I am now here with Matt Goldberg from the Commentary Track newsletter. Matt, thanks for chatting with me today.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're here to talk about The Player, the 1992 Robert Altman film. I'm going to read the plot summary of this movie from IMDb. A Hollywood studio executive is being sent death threats by a writer whose script he rejected, but which one? End quote. That is the plot of The Player. Now, the main character in The Player is named Griffin Mill, played by Tim Robbins. And there is a strong connection between this film and the studio on Apple TV Plus. Griffin Mill is the CEO of Continental Studios in the studio, played by Bryan Cranston. I want to say right out the gate that I do not think these characters are meant to be the same guy. Like, they are extremely different in temperament and style, and so it does not make sense to me that like Tim Robbins' character eventually became the Bryan Cranston character in the studio. I think it's just a situation where clearly the people behind the studio were heavily inspired by The Player, and so they wanted to kind of show some deference and present an homage to The Player. That being said, there are some similarities between The Player and the studio that are worth pointing out. Obviously, Both of them are about what it's like to make a movie in Hollywood. Both of them play around with this idea of like long continuous shots, right? The player opens with a very long continuous shot and also comments on it, similar to how the studio does a very similar thing. And they're both kind of talking about, satirizing, lampooning a style of filmmaking that then that thing that we're watching actually is. So, for instance, in the studio episode 2 called The Oneer, it's about them trying to capture a oneer, but the episode itself is a oneer. In the same way, the player, which I should mention, we're going to spoil at this point, is about how Hollywood always needs to like inject happy endings into things and like shove in a happy ending even when it doesn't feel correct and so on. And then it itself is a movie in which there is this very tacked on happy ending. So all that said, those are some of the overall similarities. I wanted to ask Matt Goldberg, you recently revisited The Player. I want to confess this was my first time watching it.
Okay.
What did you think of The Player overall, seeing it again? It sounds like you've seen it before and you came back to it recently.
Yeah, I saw it back in college for the first time, and it didn't really, I think I was a little salty about it. I felt like, and this is just sort of my own sort of baggage with like my college's cinema studies department. I'm like, how dare you? That it came off as a little smarmy. Like, how could Robert Altman chastise the industry while still making a movie within it? It was very much the meme of the guy picking his head out of the well, me being like, yet you participate in society, So it was not a great take from 18-year-old Matt. I will say, coming back to it now with a fuller understanding of how Robert Altman approaches story, and not just story, but themes. One of the things you see repeatedly throughout Altman's filmography is he is incredibly wary of institutions. You see that, with Nashville in terms of, what it has to say about America. You can see it in Gosford Park with what it has to say about the aristocracy. You see it in MASH in terms of the approach to the Vietnam War. These sort of big ensemble pictures are telling a larger story about the institutions that Altman views with a great deal of skepticism and I would say cynicism. But I would not say that The Player is necessarily a smarmy film, but it still captures Robert Altman's wariness of an industry. That it should also be remembered that The Player came out in 92. And for Altman, this is a very different Hollywood that he's entering into. The 80s were kind of a down period for him, where he was having trouble getting pictures made, or he was having trouble receiving the acclaim he had received in the 1970s as really a big player in the new Hollywood, when films like MASH was a hit, Nashville was a hit, the McCabe and Mrs. Miller, he was more of an institution. And so I think coming to this Hollywood now of the 90s, which was a very different Hollywood, more corporate, very slick, that Hollywood, Altman has he views it with a lot of skepticism. And I think The Player, by satirizing it, that particular Hollywood, is a great means of Altman expressing not only his personal ambivalence towards the industry, but also providing a larger understanding to the audience at home about like, this is how Hollywood operates, even though we're working in a satirical mold.
I had a couple big reactions to The Player. Appreciate the history about Robert Altman's career. One was, this movie was a lot darker than I thought it would be. Like,
yes,
in the first, I don't know, a half hour, 40 minutes of the movie, the main character murders another character, basically. And it's like, oh, holy shit. Like, I did not anticipate that would be kind of, having not seen the movie before, knowing anything really about it, I had not anticipated that, like, that would be a big part of the movie. And it does have this kind of like just noir feel to it, because the main character is guilty of this horrifying crime and is dealing with the consequences of that. It really reminded me in several ways of American Psycho. If you are familiar with that film, this idea of like this character who is emerging in this culture of greed and avarice and just kind of hunger for more, and as a result, doing horrible things, and then like, despite his best efforts, getting away with it, which is what happens at the end of The Player. And also, spoiler for American Psycho, but like similar to what happens at the end of that film as well. Uh, so that was one component that I just was like very, very surprised by, like the dark turn that it took. And I think the darkness is, like in the studio, much more lighthearted, right? Like there's none of that going on. And I think it's just kind of like, oh, he wanted to take this kind of the darkness that he sees, that Robert Altman sees in Hollywood, like to the extreme, right? Or screenplay writer Michael Tolkien wanted to take it to the extreme of like these people who are just kind of like, hey, I'm listening to your stories and pitches. Actually, there's like a real dark side. There's this corporatization thing going on. And oh, by the way, what if they also killed people? The second thing that struck me about The Player is how quaint the satirical elements feel compared to today. I think the sharpest the movie ever gets in terms of critiquing what the studio system is like is there's a scene where Peter Gallagher says essentially, I don't know why we need writers.
But all I'm saying is I think there's a lot of time and money to be saved if we came up with these stories on our own.
Right? Like, I don't know why we need screenwriters. We can figure out the stories ourselves. And then he takes a newspaper and he asks people around the table to read from the newspaper. 50 Chilean miners killed in mudslide. And then he will like create a Hollywood pitch based off of that. And it's so quaint compared to what we're dealing with today in Hollywood, because even in that scene, Peter Gallagher is still partaking in the creative human process in some way.
Yes.
Right? Like now in today's world, they would feed that into AI and like have AI write this. I think
that would be his dream, is to feed it into AI.
Exactly. Like Peter Gallagher, like it would blow his mind what like ChatGPT can do today, right? Peter Gallagher's character.
Right.
And so that was the other thing, is like it's fascinating to see what they were worried about back then. It's like, oh, what if studio executives think they can be in charge of? And it's like, we have much more existential threats today, in my opinion. What did you think of the sort of Hollywood satire components of the movie, Matt?
So in terms of the Hollywood satire components, I think it's interesting because one of the things that jumped out at me is it's commenting on the kinds of movies that are getting made in the 90s. And if you look at sort of that satirical element, it's very much in the high concept mold, which was sort of originated by like kind of the Bruckheimer Simpson of like Top Gun. This more of, it's going to be this meets this. And that was like that was a way to pitch a film in one sentence, and it made it very appealing to executives. Or you'd have sort of just a straight sequel. That's why like the Buck Henry joke in the opening oneer, where he's talking about, where he's pitching a sequel to The Graduate, a film he did co-write, or actually, he might have been the sole writer, but either way, I am so embarrassed because it's like my favorite film and I can't remember at this moment Buck Henry's exact credit. But he's pitching The Graduate 2, and Griffin is listening. And I think that was sort of like, oh man, what if it's just sequels to classics and this meets this? And now when you look at the studio, it's like, we're going to make a movie out of Kool-Aid.
Right.
And to me, that really does signal the shift, because I think a high concept film is actually a lot harder, because even at the end of the day, a high concept film where it's like this meets this still is not based on anything particular. You don't have to license anything, but it has no built-in audience. So you have to build that from scratch. Whereas today's market is even safer, because it's like, look, we all know what Kool-Aid is. That's a movie. And they look at the ones, like one of the few successes like Barbie, not understanding why it works and saying, well, this is the same thing. We can do this as well.
I think Calder Willingham and Buck Henry were the screenwriters of The Graduate, by the way.
Thank you.
But yeah, it's like, okay, back then, the thing they were worried about was sequel to The Graduate, right? That's what they were worried about. You and I would dream, like, that would be amazing if they made a sequel.
I don't know if I go that far. I mean, that's the thing, though. Like, there are classic...
Compared to what we're getting today, I think we'd be like, that would be incredible. Like, I'd much rather other than desecrating a hallowed work, but like, I'm saying, like, at least The Graduate is,
well, you're building off it's a movie that's lending itself to a movie rather than a beverage that's leading itself to a movie.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, so essentially I feel like things have gotten way worse. It's kind of my main takeaway from comparing the things they were worried about back then to today. Go ahead.
No, I think it's interesting, we say worse. And I think, there's two types of the Hollywood machine, because the Player comes out in 92. We haven't really gotten our Sundance boom yet, where the indie filmmakers can start getting a foothold in Hollywood. So we're really seeing sort of the tail end of an 80s corporatization, which was troubling. But I think, today we have sort of these two tiers of, there's like the Hollywood IP machine, which is sort of not only, I think it's darker, but it's also the industry responds to trends. So we're like, oh gosh, everything's getting a sequel and everything's, been based on IP. But we've also seen a lot of times where this just doesn't work and they're going to follow the money. So, a couple years ago, we're like, oh, they made a 5th Indiana Jones film and it didn't do very well. And they made a 7th Mission Impossible and it didn't do very well. And that's partially because they're spending so much money on these movies, but also it's a matter of the audience's fatigue. So with sequels and also just a more competitive environment for where they can spend their entertainment dollar. So is it bleaker that there's like, yeah, you can base a film off anything, but I like Pirates of the Caribbean. That shouldn't have worked. That's based on a ride. I love the Lego movie, but I also feel like the notion, I don't know. I get a little hesitant to like, oh, it was better back then. I think every era is plagued with some things that are problematic. And I at least like that, at least in this era, there's way more diversity behind the camera than there ever was in the world of the Player. And I think that does give you different kinds of stories.
Right, that's fair, and you kind of see that in who's pitching stories in the Player, right? It's
exactly.
like almost uniformly white dudes pitching stories in the Player. Fair point, Matt Goldberg, but I do think the example of the Kool-Aid compared to Graduate 2, that's really like, that sums it up. Is like, it was the Graduate 2 back then, now it's Kool-Aid. You can decide for yourself whether one is better than the other, or they're both horrible.
Yes.
Like that's totally fine. I'm curious, like, what you made of the kind of noir aspects of the Player. Like, is it something that really resonated with you? Is it something that you thought was ingenious? How did it work for you? Because I have to say, it just was really unexpected for me. It was not something that I saw coming.
I'm a huge fan of the noir genre. So for me, that element worked really well because not only does it tie back to something like Sunset Boulevard, but it adds a sort of deep existential thread through the Player, which I think is fascinating because part of the reason noir succeeded in the 1950s is not only did you have like a post-war country, and there was, noir before the war, but capturing that tension, but then you had the production code, which noir kind of turns on its head. The production code says that evil must be punished. That is a straight rule. So what noir does in these 40 films of the 40s and 50s is it says, okay, there is sort of a cosmic justice here. You might have a guy who gets in over his head, but when we punish him, there will be something bittersweet about it. When at the end of Double Indemnity, when this character is punished for his transgressions, there's something not righteous about it for the audience. The audience doesn't cheer this moment, but there's something sort of unnerving about how things unfolded. And that's sort of the production code enforcing this cosmic justice. By the 90s, the production code is abolished. It hasn't existed for decades. But for Griffin, Tim Robbins' character, a guy who is steeped in these pitches, in Hollywood storytelling that says things happen for a reason and there is order to the world because those are the stories I'm getting every day in every pitch. What if there wasn't? What if it's all chaos? What if my actions don't have meaning? What if there's actually nothing to hold me accountable? What does that look like? And I think that's where the Player gets really clever by essentially saying, okay, what if we use noir, but there are no more rules? And we just sort of head to this kind of existential point that feels something more in line with, you could see it in the original Insomnia. You could see it in Crimes and Misdemeanors. This idea of you can be evil and actually there are no repercussions. And that to me is why the Player's quote unquote happy ending has such a bite, because it's not really a happy ending for us, the audience, to see this bad guy get away with it, but it is a happy ending for the character. And I think that's a really fascinating conclusion.
Yeah, I found the ending of the Player to be quite unsettling, right? It feels different in tone than the rest of the film, like just color palette wise and pacing wise and music wise. Like it just feels very different than the rest of the film. the guy who has been threatening him, like they basically resolve the central mystery of the movie, like off screen.
Yeah.
No one even cares who the guy actually is. Like he doesn't have a real name that we know of. And he essentially says, hey, like, I know about the crime. Hey, it's me again. Remember me from like a year ago? Like, I'm back in your life and give me the deal. And he's like, okay, as long as you don't bother me again. All right, we're done. Like, it feels like such a pat ending. And I really appreciated that we had just watched the extremely pat ending for that Richard E. Grant pitched movie, in the movie theater
Habeas
on
corpus.
the lawn. Habeas corpus, right? And it has this line from Bruce Willis. He's saving Julie Roberts. Both of them look so young in this movie, by the way. And I think he says, like, sorry
Traffic.
I was late, traffic, right? Like something like that. And
Yeah.
It took you so long.
Traffic was a bitch.
And it's so like over the top. And then we watch the movie's version of that same ending for itself, which I just thought was very fascinating structure. I really enjoyed it and found it like unsettling. There's also something about like this banality of evil too. I think that
absolutely.
like, this guy who has been he has become more evil in the intervening year, basically. Like he has become less feeling, more cruel, as you see by the way that he like totally just kind of discards his former lover in front of everyone. And so there's something about like the movie, I think, is trying to say this job shapes you into something horrible, right? Like that's kind of what I perceive that ending to say. What do you think?
See, I don't know if I would get it necessarily the job is what's shaping him as much as I would go bigger. I think it's movies are what's shaping him. And when movies no longer conform to the reality he expects, he is essentially he is so reliant on a pat narrative structure of evil punished, like of a happy ending, that it forces itself onto anything and creates something very twisted. Because I think if you look at his former lover, she actually does care and she's cast aside. And that's the thing. There's this sort of brittle nihilism that infects the community and is rendered as positive. And you really see that with the juxtaposition of earlier in the film when Richard E. Grant's writer is pitching to Griffin, and he has this really moving ending. He's like, because that's reality. And then when they get this Hollywood ending and she chastises, he's like, what about reality? He's like, it got terrible test scores. And we changed it and people loved it. That's the reality.
Right.
And so if it's all just business,
and he's unrecognizable. He's unrecognizable from his earlier self. Yeah.
Exactly. And so to me, Griffin is sort of emblematic of, if you wanted to actually hold true to what do we expect? Do we expect the consequence? If we actually are looking for reality, what does that mean? And to me, Griffin is not so much necessarily shaped by, the industry is corrosive, as much as his dependence on a moral universe is corrosive, because he keeps expecting to be punished. And every time he isn't, he's just more emboldened to get away with it. And so I think sort of the real two scenes you need to look at is the scene that comes before the final scene, which is he's pulled into the police station. An eyewitness is going to identify him, and the eyewitness can't do it. And he's like, "Oh my God, I've just gotten away with murder." And not only does he get away with murder, he murders the woman that he married, her former lover, the writer's ex-girlfriend is now Griffin's wife and bearing his child. Like, you could not feel worse for Vincent D'Onofrio's dead writer if you tried.
Right. The studio exec murdered the writer and took his girlfriend.
And is now having a baby with her. You may as well just build your mansion on his grave.
Yeah. To be fair, she didn't seem that into him, so
No, she's not, and that's the thing. She's not the transgressor. And also Vincent D'Onofrio seems really full of himself.
Yeah, he doesn't seem like a great,
not as a person, that character whose name I can't remember. But yeah.
Yeah, David Kahane.
David Kahane seems very full of himself. And I think
that doesn't seem like a nice individual either. Like,
no, he doesn't seem.
You can't really root for him.
No, he's very bitter. He's not like he's not like, oh, I just got off the bus and I'm going to make my No, he's like if anything, part of what sends Griffin over the edge is that David is so aggressive and sort of rubbing Griffin's own perceived shortcomings back in his face.
Right. The thing that really sends him off is when he says, by the way, like, I heard about this Peter Gallagher character's thing, right? Like, what's his name?
Oh,
Larry Levy.
Larry Levy, yes.
Larry Levy, like heard Larry Levy's going to be taking over the studio. Like that's what really ticks him off, and that's what causes him to kind of lash out.
Yeah.
It's not about him as a person. It's not about you have bad taste. It's, hey, you might not climb the ladder as fast as this other guy, and that's what really upsets him.
Your identity is so tied up with your career that any sort of perceived slight to it is enough to send you into a murderous rage.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, any other thoughts on the player and how it compares to the studio? I mean, we talked about the studio already with Patrick Klepek. Matt Goldberg, I assume you're also a fan of the show, right?
I am a fan of the show. First off, I've seen the first 2 episodes. I think it's hilarious. But what I really like about it is I think it's also a continuation of, I think one of the reasons it earned sort of tying back to the player is I think it shares a similar ambivalence that Seth Rogen has shown throughout his career about how he feels about being in Hollywood. He's a native Canadian. He got into the industry very young with Freaks and Geeks. And I think he is there's always this kind of almost surprise from Rogen himself. Like, how is this my life? How is this my career? And you see it popping up again and again with the way that he's so open about the way the industry works, whether that is, being very open about how The Green Hornet was not really the film they envisioned because the budget got so big and Sony started to really clamp down on them. You can see it in This Is the End with sort of that Hollywood community and how they perceive themselves as actors. And is that really a worthwhile endeavor? And you can see it
he deeply understands that every movie that comes out is the result of hundreds of little compromises and decisions that are made along the way. And that's a lot of what the studio is about, I think. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And he has a great sort of macro sense of the business. I remember an interview he gave some years back where he was talking about like, it's very hard now to just make a studio comedy because all the comedy stuff is just absorbed into Marvel movies. So there are comedies, but they're part of like a big superhero film. If you just want to make Neighbors, that's actually a much harder lift than it is to make a superhero film.
Hugely successful film, Neighbors, right? Like, huge hit,
but even that
but can't make that stuff anymore easily, at least. So
I would watch Nicholas Stoller's Kool-Aid film. I will say that because I like Nick Stoller.
Wouldn't you also watch Martin Scorsese's Kool-Aid film?
Starring Steve Buscemi. I would watch any film that Martin Scorsese and Steve Buscemi made.
Absolutely. All right. Anyway. Matt Goldberg is the creator and writer of the Commentary Track Substack. Where can people find that, Matt Goldberg?
You can find it at commentarytrack.net.
And I'm David Chen. You're listening to or watching Decoding TV. We'll have coverage of the White Lotus season finale next week, as well as Last of Us coming up in a couple weeks. Look forward to it. See you later. Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.